as we did the last time. Okay, thank you. So, welcome you all. This is we begin that. Yeah. Welcome you all. This is the last lecture for this academic year. And first of all, I would like to thank the Danish Institute and particularly Rasmus Velsted for the hospitality here. And we are happy and we have the pleasure today to have with us Rachel Barney. Would you like, Alexander, to say a few words?
I would be delighted to say a few words. Rachel is one of the people I worked very, very closely with when I was at Princeton. It's the least of her distinctions, but she organized my files in a way that I have never been able to replicate. But she has many, many more accomplishments than that. She is now professor of philosophy and classics at the University of Toronto, and she holds a Canada Research Chair in philosophy, or is it in classics as well? I'm not quite sure about that. She did her dissertation under the advice of John Cooper, but we worked closely together. And she always tried to convince me, and sometimes successfully, that Socratic and Platonic are not as different as I sometimes think. She has written a tremendous amount of stuff and covered a tremendous range of things in Greek philosophy, from the pre-Socratics all the way to late antique philosophy. She's given the Nellie Wallace lectures on the politics of the Republic, something I'm very, very eager to see very, very soon, I hope. And she gave the most terrific set of Tanner lectures in the human values at Berkeley last year, I suppose now, is it? Yes. I was privileged to be a commentator. There were an effort to reclaim the notion of Techne, the notion of craft for virtue, and to suggest that being good at what you do, especially if it's a craft, is a good way to be. And in that way, I think has given us a really, if not completely convincing, how could it be completely convincing, since philosophy is the human institution where agreement is a form of discourtesy. She has really presented us with a very gripping Platonist account of virtue for the modern world, not a small accomplishment. Rachel, we're delighted, I would say, to have you with us, but I don't have you with me. I'm far away, but I'm delighted to be able to listen to you, and I look forward to what you have to say. Rachel Barney.
Well, thank you, Alexander, that wonderful introduction. And I'm only sorry that you can't be here. But I'm glad that you are here in spirit, anyway.
Yes.
And thanks to all the rest of you, and of course to the Danish Institute and the Academy as well. So this paper is at an early stage, and I hope you've all got the handout, either via the chat or in print if you're here in person. Can everyone hear me? I get some thumbs up for the, okay, good. I want to start by apologizing. This paper is at a very early stage, and it's going to be a bit of a mess. And among its many inadequacies is that it doesn't engage very much with the somewhat terrifying volume of course, scholarly literature on all the questions that I'll be touching on, although I think the main question is one that's been a bit ignored. So I apologize in advance if you've written a paper or book refuting any of my central claims. Just tell me about it during the question period, and we can take it from there. I'm hoping that that's one of the things this session will be useful for. The paper was provoked as a reaction to some things said by Jessica Moss and Whitney Schwab, who I think are here in some sense. So if so, you two get first call on refuting me. Okay, so here's the opening puzzle. And I'll be doing a combination of reading text and walking through the handout. Scholars of Plato have recently been concerned with the following problem. how can the guardians of Plato's Republic be qualified to rule the just city, as Plato holds them to be, by their knowledge of the good? The difficulty alleged is that this knowledge is supposed to be of a separate intelligible, the form of the good, but ruling takes place in the realm of the visible and involves judgments and actions regarding sensible particulars. An associated problem is whether and how the cognitive states which the guardians exercise in regard to particulars could itself count as knowledge, and if not, what to call it. I'll call these problems or puzzles unity and the grasp of particulars, respectively, so you've got those at the top of the handout. I want to argue that both problems dissolve when we attend more closely to how Plato himself understands the guardians' knowledge. For Plato's conception of the guardians is framed and shaped at every stage of his unfolding theory by the thought that they're possessors of a craft or art or expertise, a techne, namely guardianship, phylakike. And he actually coins this term for what they do, and it never takes off. No one else in antiquity ever uses this terminology, but it is his preferred terminology for what his rulers know. And this is, after all, just what craft is and does. It understands general principles, organized around some intelligible object or set of related objects, and it expresses that understanding in reliably correct action involving particulars. Guardianship as a craft is extreme in the refinement and abstraction of its theoretical content, but it has a perfectly familiar epistemic shape, so to speak. Though different in its degree of difficulty from carpentry and shoemaking, it's just the same in kind. It's a familiar fact, much discussed in the scholarship, that Plato's ethical inquiries, especially but not only in the Socratic dialogues, are guided by a craft model. That is, virtue is understood as a craft or something very like one. But it's less appreciated that the same is true of his epistemology, including in the Republic. From the Apology onwards, the craftsperson is Plato's paradigm of not just of the person who acts correctly, but the person who really knows something. Indeed, he could hardly have the ethical version of the model without the epistemological one. But compared to the craft model in ethics, Plato's epistemological craft model has, so far as I know, received relatively little attention. And I'm going to try to show that ignoring it, particularly in the Republic, risks obscuring some important things. Now, I should warn that this is not going to be a complete reading of the epistemology of books 5 and 7, let alone the Republic as a whole. There are lots of questions I have no views on, and I'm going to be ducking most of the hard problems. In particular, I'm going to have almost nothing to say about the argument against the sight lovers in book 5. And that may make the paper seem a bit evasive because that text is a big part, as I understand it, of the motivations for those twin puzzles I began with. But I think what I'm doing is methodologically defensible. I'm trying to begin with the easy bits. The thought is that instead of focusing solely on the very hardest passages, the most controversial passages in the Republic, we should try to start by setting out what seems obvious about the general framework that Plato is working with, and then use that to set constraints on what the right reading of the hardest parts could be. And so that's what I'm going to be attempting to do here, and I'm going to attempt avoiding taking any position on hard questions that I can avoid, such as, is Plato's conception of knowledge fundamentally propositional or object-based? And I'll let others dig into that in the question period. So I give an overview of the argument of the paper on page 1 of the handout, and I'll just walk through the highlights of that very quickly before actually working through it. So section 1 is on Techne and episteme, and I argue that Plato generally treats those terms as interchangeable. These are two names for any discipline body of human study and knowledge. That shows us that Plato rejects any deep distinction between theoretical and practical knowledge of the kind that Aristotle will have. He thinks of techne in intellectualist terms as involving a grasp of general principles about forms. So I take that to be part of his conception of craft. The craftsperson knows the relevant forms. That's explicit in the Cratylus and Republic 10. He conversely thinks of even the most theoretical-looking intellectual pursuits, notably mathematics, as techne. So no gap between the two. He does, in some contexts, and especially in Republic 5 to 7, seem to start working with a special sense of episteme on which this no longer holds, on which it's applied to a still higher form of cognition reserved for the dialectician, but that's a story we'll get to later. Section 2 on the guardian's craft. This section just works through all the many ways in which the craft model guides his account of the guardians. Section 3, what a guardian must know. In fact, a guardian must practice two crafts, guardianship itself, by which the rulers rule the just city, and dialectic, by which they know the form of the good. And that knowledge of the form of the good informs their knowledge of the good of the city, and the stargazer allegory gives us a model for how that's supposed to work. Dialectic informs guardianship in something like the way astronomy informs navigation. Section 4, I return quickly to the opening problems and argue that they're not very problematic. Because they would not, essentially because they would not be problems in the case of the doctor or any other practitioner of a techne, and the guardian is in fact no different. But there's more to be said about that, and I also talk about some problems, objections, further puzzles at the end. So let's dive through and start working through that. So, Techne and episteme, section 1. So that Plato sees little, if any, difference between techne and episteme, between what the carpenter knows and what the mathematician does, has long been recognized, though discussion continues as to whether there's some difference, any difference at all, between the two concepts for him. What does seem clear is that any gap in denotation between the two is small, and whatever difference Plato may mean to bring out by choosing one term over the other in certain contexts, it's one which he can never be bothered to clarify or theorize, and which he often doesn't care about. A good example is in Republic 4, at the crucial moment when the claim of the guardians to rule is established on the basis of their, as yet underdetermined, wisdom. For here it's assumed that Sophia is a kind of episteme, and the city is said to have many and varied episteme, and theirs just one of many. So this is text 1 on your handout. And their rivals for the title of wisdom are the paradigmatic crafts, such as carpentry and farming, and there's a quite long and boring induction, actually, that I've omitted there in the passage quoted. This use of episteme to refer to a whole body of knowledge, which could equally easily be called a techne, is strikingly holistic. So that's a term I'm going to use a fair amount, and feel free to press me on it. I'm still working out what exactly it should mean, but you'll get a general sense. Likewise, in the Theaetetus, when Socrates asks Theaetetus what episteme is, he answers by naming whole disciplines. Studies like geometry, which he studies with Theodorus, and shoemaking, and the other crafts of the artisans, aiton allon demiurgon technar. Socrates asked an underdetermined question about episteme, no article, as if it were a kind of mass term, presumably picking out a unitary cognitive condition. Theaetetus responds by listing epistemi in the plural, using the term instead as a sortal for bodies of knowledge holistically conceived. The answer isn't a bad starting point if we can assume that the cognitive condition travels with the sortal, or things included in it. That is, the condition of episteme, canonically or by default, belongs to someone who possesses one of the epistemai. Now, of course, in ancient Greek, episteme and cognates can also refer to particular items of knowledge, and this is what makes it seem sometimes a good match, misleadingly so, I think, for modern conceptions of knowledge as a kind of propositional attitude. But Plato's default use is, I want to say, the sortal and holistic one. And this suggests that for him, when a person knows some particular truth, it's because this truth belongs to the complex of an episteme holistically understood. Particular propositional attitudes or other particular cognitive states count as knowledge, at least in the canonical case, not because of some feature which could be assessed in isolation from their relation to other states, but because they belong to a complex whole which is a knowledge, or usually it gets translated as science, but that tends to occlude the fact that it's just the same term here. And presumably they inherit that honorific name by a kind of participation or metonymy. The layperson opines, the expert knows. And the key respect in which Techne differs from episteme is that it can only be used holistically and never atomically in this way. That's to say, the particular thing that a Technetes or demiurgos knows doesn't become a Techne or Techne, the way you can use episteme. And there isn't really a canonical corresponding verb either. So insofar as Plato is willing to treat episteme and Techne as interchangeable, that's a pretty valuable sign that his fundamental working conception of knowledge is this sortal and holistic one, relating the knower to some whole body of knowledge. And again, I am going to acknowledge that in the middle books of the Republic, he introduces something different, especially strong term, reserved for the dialectician. Gail Fine and Alexander Nehamas have argued for seeing a kind of holism as the upshot of the end of the Theaetetus, so that Platonic knowledge from there on involves a reliable explanatory grasp of a whole network of related objects. Well, I think that's true of Platonic episteme from the very start, and it's part of what he uses the craft model to signify in the Republic. Now, as I've already suggested, this default sense of episteme, the holistic sortal sense, is unrestricted as to subject matter. That is, Plato, so far as I can see, conceives all crafts of episteme and all bodies of knowledge as crafts. As a result, any dividing line between theoretical and practical in Plato is unstable and confusingly un-Aristotelian. The Euthydemus treats mathematics and astronomy as kinds of hunting, since they track down their results rather than making them up. The Sophist likewise groups all learning together with combat, commerce, and hunting as acquisitive. In the Statesman, conversely, ruling is theoretical. But that doesn't mean it's not practical, only that it's supervisory rather than getting its hands directly dirty. And anyway, the contrast is framed in comparative terms, suggesting that the difference is merely one of degree. Mathematics usually strikes us as wholly theoretical, but logismos or logistike, usually translated arithmetic in Plato, is what an accountant does. And geometrike is literally and originally land measurement. So these concepts are kind of messy and impurely theoretical to begin with. Plato's paradigm of theoretical knowledge in the Theaetetus and later dialogues is grammatike, the knowledge of letters and spelling. But this is just literacy, the eminently practical craft of being able to spell and write correctly. In Republic I, logistike and grammatike are cited by Thrasymachus as canonical techni in the strict sense. As such, they're models for the craft of that eminently practical ruler, the expert Thrasymachine tyrant, and by extension for the Platonic ruler to come, because Socrates takes over from Thrasymachus this idea of ruling as an expertise. So I'm going to skip a certain amount here about Plato's conception of craft and its intellectualism, and we'll just note one point that I already have as being especially important. There's obviously for Plato systematic knowledge involved in craft, and I'm going, as on almost any concept of craft, and I'm going to refer to this as knowledge of general principles. For Plato, of course, this will be not organized around knowledge of forms. And the Cratylus and Republic X make explicit that even the humble woodworker has cognitive access to the relevant forms required for his work. And you've got that on the handout. Conversely, and this is really what I mean to get at with the phrase epistemological craft model, Plato not only thinks of Techne as being or involving theoretical knowledge, he thinks of even the mathematician as a craftsperson. So there's a practical element to even the most theoretical sounding crafts. One thing this means is that, like the carpenter, the mathematician's knowledge is expressed and tested in reliable expert action. And if some body of knowledge, such as mathematics, is expressed only in logoi and perhaps in diagrams, that doesn't mean that it belongs to a different kind, but only that the actions in which it's expressed are ones such as acquiring new knowledge and, above all, testing claims in debate and attempted refutation. And as the Sophist and Statesman bring out, dialectic itself is a craft. This construal of even the most formal and abstract sciences as crafts was perhaps a standard view, At any rate, in the Protagoras, when Protagoras makes a snarky comment about the curriculum which Hippias forces on his students, he refers to arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music, all as Techne. That's Protagoras 318e. So it isn't a proprietary Socratic Platonic thought that the mathematical sciences count as Techne. Now, the natural way for us to view this near fusion of Techne and episteme, what I'm calling the default conception of episteme, and the natural way to view Plato's conception of episteme in terms of an epistemological craft model, the natural way to view all this is simply as pre-Aristotelian. That is, we might think that Plato simply doesn't have the distinction between theoretical and practical disciplines. This would have the advantage, indeed, of explaining why Aristotle makes such a fuss about it. It's his discovery. But this is a bit too simple, for we do find a related contrast in Plato's contemporaries, and even earlier. Isocrates vehemently criticizes those sophists, as he calls them, who waste their time on inquiry into the fundamental nature of reality, rather than devoting it to practical political study. He finds only a limited use for mathematics and the like as mere gymnastic, i.e. as preparatory intellectual muscle building. A similar critique of philosophy as impractical is voiced within Plato's work by Callicles and the Gorgias, and we can already see the basic case against theory in Aristophanes' Clouds, where Socrates is introduced aloft in his basket, speculating about the heavens, and this mode of inquiry is depicted as leading to atheism and moral corruption. So it would be more accurate, I think, to say that the contrast between theoretical and practical, which in Aristotle becomes an exact and elegant piece of theory in its own right, began as a much messier piece of 5th and 4th century polemic, a polemic against philosophers and scientists as devotees of useless trivia and hopelessly abstruse, unknowable nonsense. The theoretical began life as the merely impractical. And so Plato's consistent refusal to draw a distinction between the episteme and the techne expresses not a pre-Aristotelian conceptual innocence, but a conscious, even a passionate rejection of this critique. That rejection can be seen in many places, but nowhere more clearly than at the midpoint of the Republic itself, in Plato's extended defense of the philosophical nature as one qualified for rule, and above all, in the famous image of the ship of state. So this is on your handout, and I think it's number 3, but of course it's going to be an extremely familiar passage to many of you. I'm afraid my handout includes a lot of greatest hits. I can't help it. And in this and some other cases, I've only given you one key bit of the Greek that I might or might not have time to follow up on. At any rate, you remember the image. Sailors squabble over who should rule the ship, but like the wealthy ship owner and his oligarchic friends, they know nothing of navigation. There's only one person on board who really does know how to steer a ship, and this is the person rejected by both sides as a useless theoretician, namely the astronomer. What the sailors and ship owners who jeer at the astronomer fail to understand is that navigation, i.e., in the image, politics, is a craft, a techne, not just the liberty to do as you please or the knack of gaining that access to liberty, to power. As a craft, a certain body of systematic knowledge is central to it. Plato's epistemology in Republic 5-7 is such a rich piece of philosophical theorizing that it's easy to lose sight of the fact that it's also a long piece of polemic on just this point. It's an argument that only the theoretical, only sustained inquiry into the nature of reality, practiced for its own sake and well beyond the point at which it's attractive or comprehensible to the outsider, only theory in that hitherto sort of negative sense can be genuinely practical. Only that much ridiculed, impractical-looking Socratic mode of intellectual inquiry can actually qualify anyone to be a ruler. This is a truly shocking claim and fully acknowledged as such, which Plato aims to make good in the central books of the Republic. But it would be point missing to say that the true ruler must have episteme rather than mere techne. The point is that they're one and the same. Both are a systematic, practically efficacious grasp of objective truth or reality. I'll have more to say about the Stargazer passage later on, since it introduces an important complication with the idea of two crafts being practiced at once, astronomy and informed by navigation. Now, an important passage of Book 7 might seem to tell against my argument so far and my claim about this default use of episteme, where it's holistic and interchangeable with techne. And this is, actually I skipped it, this is passage 2 on the handout. In discussing dialectic as the culmination of the guardian's education, in terms designed to recall and integrate the images of the cave and the divided line, Socrates sharply distinguishes it from, as he puts it, the other crafts, including the mathematical sciences. He says of these, from force of habit, we've often called these crafts sciences, episteme, kinds of knowledges, but they need some other name, clearer than opinion, doxa, darker than knowledge, episteme. We called them thought somewhere before. But I presume we won't dispute about a name when we have so many more important matters to investigate. So this alludes to the divided line passage not long before at 511, and we've just been reminded in the earlier part of the passage that the objection to these disciplines is, as per the divided line, that they depend on hypotheses, which they leave untouched and can't give any account of. Now, there's a lot going on in this passage and obviously in the divided line, but for my purposes, the first point is again a kind of obvious one, that here too, there's still no distinction between theoretical and practical. Mathematics, astronomy, and the like are presented as uncontroversially crafts. The special feature of the passage is, of course, that techne and episteme are for once drawn apart quite violently, but this is the exception that proves the rule. For Socrates is explicit that this is a departure from his habitual usage and not one he's going to regularly insist on. He says, we're not going to bother about names. His purpose in contrasting the two here seems to be simply that episteme is a more powerfully honorific term than techne. So when the point at hand is to emphasize the superiority of dialectic over all other inquiries, episteme is appropriately restricted to dialectic alone. Nous and noesis were tried out for this honorific purpose in the divided line passage itself. Being less strongly honorific, techne can still be used for mathematics, astronomy, and lesser pursuits, and presumably dialectic does continue to count as a craft as well. Note the phrase, the other crafts. So episteme is now being hived off for something distinct from what I've called the default use, and that's something that only the dialectician can attain, and craft continues to be used as before for all forms of intellectual study, dialectic still included. And this difference in status is motivated, it's explicitly grounded on the fact that the dialectician alone has an unhypothetical grasp of forms. That's what warrants attributing a higher cognitive state to them. This super honorific use of episteme is what I'm going to call the strong sense of the term, as opposed to the default use. It picks out the cognitive state promised by fully achieved dialectic, which is the highest available to a human being. Besides appearing as the highest level of the divided line, this presumably corresponds to the fully outdoor, upward-gazing cognition of the freed cave dweller. Whether episteme in the strong sense is also used in the sight lover's argument is less clear to me, and I would say it probably isn't, at least not unambiguously. For Plato warns us there that a cognitive power is individuated by what it's set over and what it accomplishes. And we're surely meant to wonder at that point, what about powers which are set over the same thing but accomplish different results? So we have two criteria for the individuation of powers, and it seems clear that the two could in principle come apart. Well, that question is then answered by the divided line, where we learn that the mathematicians and other craftspeople deal in forms but have only a defective grasp of them, dependent as they are on hypotheses and sensible particulars used as images, while dialecticians alone have knowledge or nous or noesis in the strong sense. This means that, seen in retrospect, the sight lover's argument is missing a key distinction, and we shouldn't take what it says about episteme to be final or indeed clear. The argument is, after all, as Alexander has also recently argued on other grounds, very much preliminary and ad hominem. And that's all I'm going to say about it here. Be all that as it may, the important sense is that the ordinary master of the ordinary craft, who has episteme in the default sense, doesn't have it in the strong sense, restricted to this handful of contexts. Okay, that's section 1 on trying to get clear on how Techne and episteme work for Plato. I now turn to guardianship as a craft, section 2. Throughout the argument of the Republic, the framework of craft guides Plato's developing account of the just city and the rulers of the guardians. And I've given you an inventory of some of the moments at which you can seem to be seen to do so as per the handout. So I give you this inventory because sometimes you see it said that Techne is very important for Socratic ethics and political thought, and it's super important in Book 1, where it's crucial for the argument between Socrates and Thrasymachus. But then after that, it fades from view, and Plato has perhaps even given up on any thought that Techne could be an important tool for his understanding of virtue and wisdom. And I think that's clearly mistaken, and here's the evidence. So, number 1, yes, indeed, in Book 1, Socrates' debate with Thrasymachus regarding the real ruler is indeed centered on the question of whether it's the just or the unjust ruler who is an expert craftsman. And I take that actually to set the agenda for the Republic as a whole. Socrates adopts the conception of the true ruler as a craftsperson from Thrasymachus, uses it to refute him, and never discards it. It's what we get worked out, operationalized, realized in the rest of the Republic. Point number 2, in Book 2, Socrates locates the origin of the city so this is the first city, obviously, the city of pigs, in the interdependence of craft practitioners. And the whole subsequent discussion by which the just city evolves is presented as a supplement to this principle of specialization in 2 steps. First, the military are introduced as practicing a distinct craft in the fevered city, and second, the rulers are distinguished from the military as a third class. Number 3, it's this third kind of craft, guardianship, which is said to make the city wise and good in Book 4, as we saw, with the other crafts presented as its natural rivals to that title. So all the way through Books 2 to 4, we're getting Plato developing his own concept of the true expert ruler, very underdetermined as yet, because we don't know what they have to know. But if you like, the Thrasymachus template is not rejected. It's only been enriched by the backstory about the origins of a city and the distinction between craft-based classes within it. Point 4, in Books 5 to 7, we learn how nature, physis, and education, paideia, didaskalia more specifically, must combine to make the guardians adequate to their jobs. These are 2 of the standard requirements for acquisition of any craft. Likewise, the earlier account of the military, proto-guardians, later designated auxiliaries in Books 2 to 3, which discuss their guard dog-like natures and their preliminary education. So it's not always obvious, but again, throughout Books 2 to 4, and again, actually in 5 to 7, we get the 3 factors essential to craft: physis, didaskalia, and some kind of ascesis, experience training, being applied to the case of the guardians, first on the sort of pre-philosophical conception, if you like, in Books 2 to 4, and then again in 5 to 7. More specifically, point 5, the guardians must also have the third canonical component of craft, care, practice, training, or experience. Different ways to spell this out. I'm going to go with empiria, but melite and ascesis are also relevant concepts. This is mostly unnamed and untheorized in the Republic, but it comes out at various places. Notably, I'm going to say a bit more about this later in the claim that the guardians must spend a full 15 years in the field as junior civil servants before resuming their dialectical studies and coming to grasp the form of the good. So that comes up in section 3. Point 6, in Book 5, the argument that women must become guardians is framed entirely in terms of craft norms. And again, there's an appeal to the physis relevant for practicing different crafts. Point 7, though they may not accumulate wealth or property, the guardians receive wages from the rest of the city for their work, just like any other demiurgoi. And the reason they can't possess any wealth is that it would ruin them for doing their job, which is the same principle on the basis of which some, but only a limited, accrual of wealth is permitted to the producer class. This shows that fundamentally, formally speaking, they're craft worker citizens like everybody else, subject to the same fundamental norms. Point 8. The account of the philosophical guardian's craft culminates in an extended analogy with the craft of painting, which likewise looks away to a model and attempts to reproduce it through correct mixtures. Point 9, the fall of the just city is due to a failure, perhaps to an inherent limitation of craft, deriving from the guardian's failure in calculation together with perception. A bit like the limitations on the demiurge and the Timaeus, perhaps. 10, when Plato revisits the topic of political theory in the Statesman, it's once again to situate ruling as one craft among many, and then to emphatically correct the original Book 1 model of the shepherd for the ruler, replacing it with the paradigm of the weaver. There's perhaps a continuity with the painter of the middle books here. So I think I'm just going to leave that at that. I'm happy to come back to any of those points. You see what the overall inductive point is supposed to be here. The guardians of the just city are, above all, craftspeople, practitioners, as I say, of phylakike, selected for their natural ability at it, taught, and appropriately trained, and this is what legitimates their rule. So the subtext here is that I'm on a bit of a crusade against the phrase philosopher kings. I think that's a deeply misleading phrase. And it's not one that Plato himself uses, unlike phylakikoi, phylakes, etc. Philosopher kings is wrong on multiple counts. One thing, they're not all male, right? You have to specify philosopher kings and queens every time. Their rule is not hereditary in any strong sense. There's reshuffling with every generation, and a great deal of sort of testing of candidates and so on. And although he entertains the possibility of there being solo rule, it's clear that solo autocracy is not what he has in view. There's not going to be only one of them at a time. There are a whole leadership core. And for what it's worth, I think the phrase philosopher kings actually only becomes prominent in the 18th century, with figures like Voltaire sucking up to Frederick II, and various philosophers writing to kings and telling them, encouraging them to become the philosopher king, and or at least have some philosophers around as a second best. So I think it's coming from a very distorting place to guide our views of Plato. Okay, section 3, what must a guardian know? Well, in principle, this is where I owe you a whole reading of the Plato's epistemology, which you're not going to get. And instead of trying to give a comprehensive portrait, I'm going to focus on just a couple of points. Because it's, you might think that identifying what the guardians know as a matter of craft would be very helpful at this point, but that isn't really the point of this paper. That isn't my claim, because in fact, Plato never defines craft or theorizes in any rich way. It's as if he continually assumes that we all know what a craft is, and it's always the explanans, not the explanandum. He never makes it the subject of theorizing in itself. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of aspects of what the guardians should know, which are relevant to some of the preceding sections and also the ones to come. And the first point is that as per the stargazer analogy, and indeed the whole argument of books 5 to 7, guardianship is only one of two crafts which Plato's guardians have to practice, the other being dialectic. These are two very different things, so that's the main thing I want to stress here. And indeed, it's crucial for the argument that they are so. For one thing, the guardians must prefer the one to the other. It's a necessary condition of their legitimacy that they only rule reluctantly and would prefer to spend their time philosophizing. So we should avoid any tendency to sort of smush dialect and ruling into a single activity. It's important for Plato's argument that they're kept and seen as very distinct. Moreover, they're clearly different in content. As dialecticians, the Guardians study being in its entirety, organized around knowledge of the good itself as the unhypothetical principle. This study produces directly only knowledge itself and the logoi in which it's expressed and tested. Meanwhile, guardianship knows the good of the city, which is the end that it pursues and produces on behalf of the whole. I assume that the good of the city is the human good writ large, but there are deep questions of political theory here, which I won't attempt to address. For what it's worth, I do think that it's important to Plato that the good pursued by guardianship, the good of the city, whatever exactly it is not the same as the good itself known by dialectic. And that's in part to avoid problems of circularity if you turn the two of those into the same thing. I think you can see him worrying about this in the Charmides and the Euthydemus and also at Republic 505. So, again, the Guardians have two crafts: ruling, spelled out by Plato as guardianship, and dialectic, expressed wholly in intellectual activities and taking them to the top of the divided line. This has the arguably unfortunate implication that they're in violation of the principle of specialization, but I think at this point Plato would just say, c'est la vie. There's no other way that ruling can be practiced competently at all, and that warrants making an exception of his formal rule in this case. What does this double status imply for our account of what the Guardians know? Well, qua Guardian, it means we have to look at it from two different angles. Qua Guardians, they have an episteme or a techne in the default sense. Qua dialecticians, they have knowledge in the strong sense, nous, noesis, the state at the top of the divided line. This latter knowledge means that they can grasp the starting points of other techni in a non-hypothetical way, and thereby transform them. In principle, dialectic could ground any craft in the way it does ruling. I think the dialectician doctor, for instance, would be able to see what's good about health, which he pursues as the end of his craft, and grasp it in a non-hypothetical way. And as so often, the implication of the Stoic view is made explicit by the Stoics, as they say, only the wise person can fully and stably possess a craft. Only the sage could be a good diviner, poet, a true ruler, an expert rhetorician, etc. And they add that in that person, craft is transformed into something like a virtue. But I don't detect anywhere Plato working out these possibilities himself in the Republic. And in fact, I think that Plato continues to think of guardianship as a discrete craft, not really transformed in the Stoic way by dialectic, but rather grounded and formed indirectly by it in the same way that astronomy does navigation. And a sign that he continues to think of it as a somewhat normal craft is that at the very end of Book 7, we get a crucial ingredient added to the mix. Here, and I think I've given you the passage on that. So this will be, on page 5, text 1 for section 3. He says that the rulers to be are to spend 15 years in a practical apprenticeship as civil servants and military officials before ascending to the vision of the good, so that they won't be inferior to the others in experience, in empiria. And as I've already said, empiria is a crucial part of any craft, the kind of competence gained from a sustained experience of and effortful engagement with particulars. Some version of something like this is, as I've noted, the traditional third component of Techne, along with natural gifts and instruction. The basic point is already made in the case of warfare in Book 5, which I've also put on the handout as text 2. Here again, the point is that the Guardians should have at least as good preparation for their work as the children of ordinary craftspeople do for theirs. I take it that the others here at 540 are the practitioners of lesser crafts. In short, Plato's endorsing a claim made explicit and emphasized by Aristotle in Metaphysics, Book 1, Chapter 1. The complete mastery of any craft requires empiria as well as logos, theory. There's also a point worth noting here about timing. why should the guardians have to gain political and practical experience before their final round of dialectic, as a prelude to the ascent to the good? I suppose there might be a boring answer to that. Maybe the city needs a lot of junior civil servants for some reason we're not told, or maybe this is a good moment to weed out unsuitable candidates for higher office. But I suspect that there's a deeper point, an epistemological one. Plato is suggesting, as I think he already did at 402, that's passage 3 on the handout, Plato is suggesting, I think, that the grasp even of logos within a craft requires empiria. That is, that the guardians need to know sensible particulars in a reliable way, including being able to recognize them as instances of what they are, if they are to gain the highest knowledge of the good. And it seems to me that this is a reasonable view. The rulers plausibly would be impaired in their ability to grasp the nature of the good if they lacked a wide experience of the many different forms that it can take in the everyday life of a city, in complex local problems and decision-making challenges. And I have in mind here some of the kinds of challenges that Whitney Schwab talks about with his vision of guardians doing tax policy in a complicated way. If this is right, then Plato's conception of political wisdom is balanced and again strongly holistic or integrated. Only philosophers can rule for the best because only the person with a full understanding of the good of the city can reliably recognize all its variegated instantiations, and that requires a knowledge of the good itself. But conversely, that understanding is in turn available only to someone with an advanced grasp of practical politics, gained from extensive experience of particular cases. Again, the point is already suggested at 402. Expertise means reliably recognizing the images of letters as well as the originals. If all this is right, then Platonic craft mastery, although highly intellectual, is a lot less top-down than we sometimes tend to assume. It turns out that didascalia and empiria have a reciprocal relation. Both are necessary for craft, each depends on the other, and the acquisition of the two must be intertwined in a chronological progression. So, what should we say of the pair of problems with which I began? Again, these are, so moving on now to section 4 and some rapid about the problems, and then section 5, even more rapid looking ahead. What should we say about the pair of problems or puzzles with which I began? Again, these are unity. How does their knowledge of general principles qualify the guardians to make particular judgments about what will be best for the city? And grasp of particulars, should those particular judgments themselves be counted as knowledge? And if not, what are they? Well, on the handout, I've given you some excerpts from the works of Moss and Schwab, who are responsible for this paper by getting me thinking about the problems. And though I've learned an enormous amount from their work and admire it, in my view, their answers don't sound quite right. I won't go over them in detail, but you can probably by now see why I find what they say unsatisfactory. They both worry that there's a gap to be bridged here between two things different in kind, and take it that the ruler's knowledge is essentially about general principles, so that some explanation involving a further cognitive condition is required to extend it to particulars. And Jessica Moss and I have had a back and forth about exactly how to phrase that, and she may not still be happy with that, but we'll get to it in questions. My thought is, again, that if the default sense of episteme just is techne, and both are holistic and integrated in the ways I've argued, then this isn't so. The problem evaporates. All we need to say is that there's nothing formally special about guardianship as a craft. Unity is only a problem for them if it's also a problem for the doctor, say, and in the case of the doctor, nobody seems to be worried about it. Craft is an everyday reality, and craft just is the acquired rational power by which an understanding of general intelligible principles is routinely expressed in successful particular judgments and actions. There may be deep puzzles about the nature of the human mind and action theory about how all this is possible, but there's no special problem for Plato or his guardians in particular. As for the grasp of particulars problems, again, we should ask, what would we say in the case of the doctor? When Hippocrates treats a particular patient, say Callias, with a particular disease, say jaundice, Should we say that he knows the particular facts about Callias' symptoms which guide his diagnosis and treatment, or not? Well, so put, the question seems to me to be a sophistic dilemma, better rejected than answered. The doctor's grasp of particular facts has a prima facie claim to be considered knowledge, insofar as it's part of his techne. This incorporation into the integrated cognitive machinery of his knowledge gives him a far stronger, richer, more reliable grasp of Callias' symptoms than the layperson or the quack can have. And since knowledge is the canonical term of endorsement for marking these kinds of superiority, it seems legitimate to use it for the bite-sized part as well. So I take it that what I'm calling bite-sized parts of cognition, particular judgments made by the person who knows, inherit the name of the whole episteme in the default sense, even though they don't with Techne. At the same time, on Plato's consistent view, the general principles of medicine are themselves much more knowable than the symptoms of the individual, so much so that only the dialectician doctor could know them in full, and that would be knowledge in the strong sense, at the top of the divided line. So whether to say that the doctor knows that Callias has jaundice will depend on which contrast we have in view, which is contextually more important. The one between his well-founded certainty and the unreliable guesses of the non-expert, or the contrast between the local, changeable character of this particular judgment made by the doctor and his more systematic, explanatory, fertile understanding of what jaundice is. So we should expect Plato to vary his usage contextually, sometimes willing to use knowledge terms for these more particular judgments and sometimes not, and I take it that is indeed what we see. So, I hope to have made at least a preliminary case for reading the knowledge of the Guardians and more generally episteme as Plato understands it in the Republic, as in the default usage, Techne. For the sake of future debate, since it's not always clear whether scholars mean to accept or deny this, it simply doesn't get discussed in this framework. So to aid in future debate, I've listed some conclusions on page 7. And I take it these are things which other folks might want to deny, and I would be curious to hear arguments on those in the question period. And I'll just go through them very briefly and note some other matters for future discussion. So first off, as I've argued, Plato recognizes no systematic division of knowledge into the two Aristotelian kinds, practical and theoretical. 2, thus the episteme are techni and the techni are episteme. For the purposes of the epistemology of the Republic, there's no fixed difference between the two in denotation, and little in sense or nuance, except that episteme is, at times, and arguably, that's a bit weak. I've been revising as I go in the last 48 hours, and I think I would now say definitely. An especially strong sense developed in 5 to 7, a stronger term of commendation. Yeah, so I think I should rewrite number 2 there a bit, because the more I think about it, the more I think it's actually important to get clear that this distinct strong sense is a reality, and something quite distinct from the default use. But it is grounded on the fact that episteme is a term of commendation, and that it can be used in this kind of super honorific way to be equivalent with noesis. Third, in craft knowledge, both the understanding of general principles or intelligibles and correct judgment and action about particulars are criterial and constitutive. Each informs and aids in the other, as with the case of the trainee civil servant. Any genuine practitioner of any genuine craft deals with and must have some kind of knowledge of the relevant forms. So nothing special about the Guardians so far. 4, Plato's conception of knowledge is thus radically holistic. This means inter alia that it's an episteme or techne, a whole kind of cognitive web, which is for him knowledge first and foremost, and that other things, including bits of that episteme, whether regarding particulars or general principles, count as knowledge by virtue of their inclusion in it. 5th, so it's wrong to think of the expert judgment about particulars as distinct from their expertise in a secondary derivative application of it. 6, Plato is speaking literally and seriously when he speaks of the guardians as craftspeople, practitioners of phylakike, and this conception is pervasive and determinant in his account of them throughout the Republic. Strictly speaking, they possess two techni, hierarchically linked: philosophy construed as dialectic and ruling construed as phylakike, as well as the military art qua former auxiliaries. And philosophy construed as dialectic, fully achieved, also provides them with episteme in the strong sense, the highest cognitive state. So obviously, many puzzles and issues left there for further discussion, and I'm sure many objections. Here are some of the worries I have, just to round things off and get the discussion going. First of all, what exactly is the relation between guardianship and the superordinate craft of dialectic? Is there a good model to be found in other craft hierarchies, perhaps like the ones in Aristotle, Nicomachean, and Ethics 1.1? Does the stargazer analogy properly capture it? I have some worries about the stargazer, which I think I won't tell you about unless you press me on them in questions, but it's a tricky passage. Second, is dialectic a craft, strictly speaking, in the Republic? If it deals only with forms, does that make it an exception to my account of craft, on which it's in the nature of a craft to enable you to deal with particulars? I'm going to answer no to that question, but I can imagine being pressed on it. The particulars that a dialectician is able to deal with are going to be particular questions, particular attempts at refutation, and it isn't clear that the logoi fit neatly into that category of particulars in such a way as to correspond to other crafts. But I think that has to be the case. It's not the only craft that deals with logoi alone. And finally, granted that Plato develops this strong sense of episteme in certain points in Republic 5-7, denying it to craftspeople, including mathematicians, etc., and reserving it for dialecticians alone, does this raise problems for my account? Again, I'm going to answer no, but your mileage may vary on that. My sense is that craft has tended to be marginalized in discussions of the epistemology of the Republic because the strong sense in 5-7 is seen as sort of washing away the more general framework that I set out in section 2 and replacing it with something very different. I don't think that's true. I think we need to see the guardians as craftspeople first and foremost to understand what's going on. But obviously, I will be very interested to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Typical Rachel paper, clear, to the point, provocative, elegant, and in many ways probably true. I am sure there are questions. I see Gail already has her hand raised. I'm sure there are people in the audience there whom I can't see, so maybe Thanassis will help me with that. And of course, people can also submit questions on the comments. But the best thing to do is to raise your hand electronically, and then you'll just get yourself in the queue, unless Thanassis interjects somebody from the audience at. Let
us begin with the audience here, however. And then I will let you know someone here.
So shall we have Gail then ask the question? Gail?
Okay, thank you. I know there's a note from Whitney and Jessica saying they both have questions but can't raise their electronic hand.
Oh.
Jessica wants to ask them first. That's okay. She said at the beginning she wanted to.
They're fair enough, Gail. That's very, very nice of you. Yes, go ahead, Jessica. Or Schwan.
I don't need to be first.
Witka.
Let's hear again. Sorry, I'm happy to wait. I just wanted to register.
Okay, Gail, go ahead.
Okay, this is about the your very last 2 points about whether if it deals only with forms, does that make it an exception? And what about the strong sense of episteme? So, I mean, a lot of people have well, wondered, as you know, whether Plato thinks there can be knowledge of perceptibles. And some people say yes, some people say no, only belief or something else. Do I take it that your answer is yes and no to the question of whether they have episteme? They don't have it in the strong sense, but they do have it in this other sense that you don't think, and you think Plato sometimes uses it in a weaker sense than what you're calling the strong sense. So that would still be saying that there's two different cognitive conditions with respect to, I mean, if that's what your view, that they do have weak episteme of particulars, but not strong episteme of particulars, that's still saying it's a different cognitive condition that they have with respect to the two, whether you want to call it weak and strong episteme or whether you want to call it episteme and doxa. And let's say that some doxai are better than others, those, namely those informed by or somehow making use of, but not amounting to episteme. And then I wondered whether that's a really significant different way of putting it, or just it starts to be more terminological, whereas the crucial question for some people is whether you can have the same cognitive condition about the two, whatever you want to call them.
Well, I think you can. I think, I mean, you're asking a question that's sort of orthogonal to the points that I want to emphasize, and I'm not trying to enlist in the debate that you're putting front and center here, but what I would say is that the person who has craft has expert cognition of both forms and particulars, and that whether a particular judgment that they make about particulars gets counted by Plato as episteme is going to depend on the context, but that if we have to choose, I think it is preferable to say that yes, you can have knowledge of sensible particulars in Plato. I think he's pretty clear that something special happens at the top level of the divided line, and that something involves thought about forms only. And so I don't want to resist the implication that there's a highest cognitive condition which is directed only at forms. But I don't think that's what he typically means about when he talks about episteme, and I do think there's a value to seeing that and making that point, and I suspect that most of the questions I'm going to get are going to be based on outrage about it. And that highest state, nous, noesis, whatever you want to call it, as I say, I don't think that's his default use of episteme. I don't think it's what I don't think he's clearly separated it off in the sight lovers argument. I doubt that it's what he's talking about in the Theaetetus. I think he's more likely, certainly if you think the seventh letter is authentic, or even that it's a good work of Platonism, it's there separated off as nous, and I think that is his usual tendency. But what's more important for me is insisting on the holism and the fact that any cognitive state, to know whether to count it as episteme in the default sense, episteme in the strong sense, neither of the above, mere doxa, you're going to have to look at the overall cognitive condition of the person who articulates that judgment or holds that judgment or whatever it might be. And it's only by looking at their cognitive state as a whole that you're going to be able to say, this person has mere doxa, this person has episteme or craft, this person has nous. And that's the thought that's more important to me.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Jessica and Whitney.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm glad actually Gail went first, because the way she put it is sort of kind of the debate that I took myself to be getting engaged in with the things that I said in the paper. So I'm trying to think about how much we actually disagree.
Yes.
But so on this, so the question I asked is on, because here's another way of maybe getting at the issues in the way that should apply more directly to how you want to treat them, as best I'm understanding it, is the bite-size idea. And it's certainly true, like there's episteme of geometry and maybe episteme or whatever you want to call it of the Pythagorean theorem, and there's episteme of carpentry and then episteme of, or techne of and why, pine wood is the best wood to use for chairs and what have you. And I think I don't want to, which Plato thought was definitionally prior to the others, I have views on, but the worry then is you just moving from the idea that yes, Plato does have this view on which he does talk about holism and then bite size, but then saying some of the bites can be like about perishable, contingent, non-eternal things strikes me as a fundamentally different question of how that all could be in the same cognitive condition. Like why you wouldn't. So it's something, because on your view, it sounds like part of the techne of carpentry is quite different now than it was in 20 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So I don't know if I'm trying to understand what you mean by like holism versus bite size. But it seems like it's importantly like if the bites include taking a bite out of perceptible world that presents itself to you in your spatio-temporal location, how we don't introduce the kind of problem that I took myself to be trying to grapple with and that Gail was alluding to. I think that might be a way of putting it more in your terminology.
Right. Yeah, I think my hunch is that we do disagree about something, and that it's the something that comes out in your conception of the second opinion being the good model for, because you and Jessica both, and this is why I'm picking on you, is because you're so close to getting it right. You see that there's a craft model in the background, and you do solve these two problems, but you see yourself as sort of having to build a bridge to this other thing. And I want this more kind of Zen move of, no, you're already there. You don't need a further bridge to this other thing. It's not a second opinion, which makes it sound like it's this special thing, not what the doctor usually does. This is just what doctors do. And so I think the issue here turns on, what we say about the status of the bite-sized thing. That's to say, the particular judgment about sensible particulars, this guy is yellow, this guy has jaundice, whatever it might be. This wood is going to be good for making a ship, etc. And I want to say that when someone is making those judgments as an expression of their techne or their episteme, there's the only pressure for not calling it episteme is if Plato wants, and he does sometimes want, to make a point about the defectiveness of the object. So if you look at 402, I didn't really discuss that, but that's an important passage from me. That's, text 3 at the bottom of page 5 and going over to page 6. So here we get the model of knowledge based on grammaticae, actually, and this is a huge trailer for the late dialogues, right? This model of knowledge as grammaticae is going to be all over the Theaetetus, statesman, sophist, Philebus. And here it's combined with what we might think of as the distinctive republic, metaphysical hierarchy, right, where you've got images, and the image seems to be an image of the sensible particulars, and then you've got the real things, and those are modeling the forms. But look at the point that Socrates is actually using it to make. if there are images of letters reflected in mirrors or water, we won't know them until we know the letters themselves, for both abilities are part of the same craft and discipline.
Discipline, I don't know.
So melite, right, which is very interesting, and there's some other moments where melite comes in an interesting way.
With a shipman and all that, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one small puzzle I'd like to get traction on at some point, is why does he keep throwing melite in? But maybe it's just part of this third thing together with empiria. Anyway, so I take that to mean that in a sense, even though these kinds of cognition are aimed at different kinds of object, and some kinds of object for Plato are more real than others. I mean, I accept that. But the cognition itself is equally in good working order, and each kind requires the other kind. They're equally constitutive of this techne. So I'm against prejudice against bite-sized cognition of sensible particulars. I think the way to view that is as an essential component of a techne and an episteme, and having a pretty good claim on nice words like that, even when viewed in isolation, as long as it is in fact expressing that holistic state. And the ordinary person's cognition of that thing is completely different and will only ever deserve the term doxa. That's, I think, the dividing line that Plato usually cares about.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanassis, do you have somebody from the audience? Oh, Jessica, you wanted to say something too?
Let us go on later.
So Jessica, go ahead then.
Yeah.
Speak.
Thanks. Hi. Sorry, Whitney and I didn't mean to team up on this time. It just happened that we both needed to be in the audience. We didn't know we would be joint targets. Anyways, hi, Rachel. This is super interesting, and we've gone back and forth a bunch. I mean, I did have the same reaction that Gail had and that Whitney had, which is, are we really disagreeing, or is this terminological? So I think rather than focus on that question, maybe I will come at it slightly indirectly. Some of the questions, objections, further puzzles that you raised at the end were ones that I'd been thinking about and puzzling about. And maybe I'll start with the second of those that you have at the end. Is dialectic a craft in the Republic if it deals only with forms? Because I was willing to say, and I think I just completely agree with you that Techne is his model of I want to say in every practical domain. It is interesting that he calls the mathematics and the things that are at the third level, the DN, that he calls those techni also. But certainly whenever we have something like ruling or elbulia, that's going to be a techne. But why isn't it the case that what you do at the top of the line is you just contemplate the forms and you just get to know them? And the only thing that this dunamis accomplishes, apergadzatai, its only ergon, is itself knowledge. And it's not moving things around in the world or creating further things, or except for maybe, virtue and knowledge in yourself, as he says. This to me seemed like a purely, I want to say purely theoretical, and think you'll balk at that, but also it doesn't have what I think you really do agree with me and others in thinking of as a kind of two-component. It's not you look at the forms and you're using them to do something else, you're just looking at the forms. I kind of want to keep talking for a moment and talk about astronomy, but maybe astronomy and navigation, but maybe I'll pause and...
Right. Thanks. Well, I do want to hear what you think about astronomy and navigation, but we can get to that later, maybe. I guess one question would be, do you think the same about mathematics? Do you think that the perfected mathematician just sort of contemplates mathematical objects? I think we find it more natural to think of these highly theoretical pursuits as active, as creative, as involving thinking different things over time and doing things with those things. And I'm a bit influenced here, I guess, by later dialogues, because I don't see why Plato's view on this would change, it's clear that in the statesman, dialectic is a craft, and that the same rules apply to it as other crafts. And he actually introduces this very serious chunk of doctrine about how every craft has to have normative measure in order to illustrate his claim that basically you can never spend too long doing dialectic, or at least whoever objects to his account of weaving is failing to understand how useful it all is as a paradigm in dialectic. So it's a craft there. It's, I don't know about craft language offhand, but in the Phaedrus, for instance, it seems clear that the stronger and higher and more complete knowledge is, the more fertile it is, right? And its natural expression is to implant logoi in the soul of the beloved, and those are going to be fertile in turn. So I don't think Plato's vision of the guardians on their days off is of people just sitting and contemplating, if that's meant to be some kind of meditative, empty mind state. I think they're arguing with each other, and they're producing novel arguments and novel attempts at refutation of each other. And that's, I think, that's supposed to be, that shouldn't seem too alien, should it? That's their idea of fun, and that's what makes them philosophers, and there's always some new challenge to the theory to be worked out in the common room. So no, I don't think it's contemplative in that, I don't know, Christian or otherwise religious.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
So I guess maybe here's a distinction. There's crafts on the kind of what I would think of as a kind of paradigmatic craft model. And I'm also thinking of some of Claudia Yao's work here, where you're looking at a paradigm and you're applying that to something else. And so that if we think about astronomy and navigation, the true Techne having navigator is looking to the stars and applying those to where you steer the ship. And we hear that so often with, in Book 10 of the Republic, the carpenter's going to look at the form and put that in the bed and so on. And that's the kind of craft that the rulers have, the ruling craft, obulia. I don't now, whether he uses the word techne or episteme or any of the different words he uses, I don't see anything like that in the case of dialogue, although it is interesting to think about how it goes. So that's what I meant. Maybe saying purely theoretical or purely contemplative isn't quite the right way, but you're just into the forms for the sake of the forms. You're not into the forms for the sake of seeing how they make sense of other things. And I think that's the distinction that I thought was important. And I thought there's a mystery. I think that, well, maybe, this is just to go back to what Gail was saying and to what Whitney's saying. There is a mystery. I think Plato puts dialectic on the divided line. He puts it all the way up at the top. It is not so clear to me where he wants to put crafts like navigation or crafts like ruling. And it does seem like there's a bit of a gap.
Well, I think on the account I've given, I didn't want to get too deeply into the divided line because it might never come back out again. But I think on the account I've given, craft and episteme in the default sense have to be dianoia, right? They have to be the third, second from the top, because they deal, he says as much, they deal in forms but using hypotheses. And that's the nature of their defectiveness.
Right, just to jump in, so you do what the carpentry, good carpentry, according to you, real craft carpentry instead of some kind of lesser carpentry is really going to be at the third level of the line. That person is going to have a hypothesis about the form of the bed and the form of the good and the form of the useful. Or something?
I think they're going to have a hypothesis about the end of their craft. What they have is local, right? They're not going to be, it's not like they're trainee dialecticians. But I think that the carpenter or the doctor, they take the end of their craft as given. That's their hypothesis. And they ratiocinate on that basis.
I just want to register. It's a really interesting and really weird view, but it's yeah, I mean, what I wound up saying in my book is that ruler's craft is somehow like dianoia in that you have awareness of the forms and have awareness of the perceptibles and you're somehow looking back and forth. But for dianoia, your focus is maybe more on trying to understand the imperceptible. And for the crafts, your focus is more on using the imperceptible to shape the perceptible.
I mean, the problem is each of these images is trying, I think, to articulate better and better, what different cognitive states are there? How close and how far are they from being anything you could call wisdom? What are they at their best? I mean, dianoia would be odd taken as and unhelpful taken as a picture of what most craftspeople spend their time thinking about. It's more this is a certain kind of condition viewed as a candidate for knowledge, and here are its limitations. The focus is entirely on the limitations, right? And the example is mathematics, which again he talks about as a craft over and over. So I don't think one has much choice actually about where to.
But he does want to distinguish mathematics and those others from the other crafts, right? In that text that you had around 533, the other ones are concerned with doxine.
I want to give other people the opportunity to speak, not just because I have my hand up. I want other people to speak first, but I think it's time to get other people involved.
Can I just answer the initial question? So I do not think that the only kind of craft is the kind which puts a paradigm in matter. Those would be productive crafts. Again, not clear that it would apply to mathematics, for instance. There are many kinds of crafts, and Plato carves them up differently in different texts. There's productive, there's therapeutic, there's who knows what other categories. He never gives us a complete typology. Yeah, I think ruling is one kind of craft, dialectic is another, and dialectic just so happens to have this special feature that if fully achieved and pursued, it will actually give you knowledge in the strong sense. I don't think that impugns its craft status. Plato doesn't seem to think that it does. And the only question that seems to be a bit worth worrying over is the craft status of any craft which deals in logoi rather than sensible particulars, because that does raise a metaphysical puzzle about, what is the ontology of a logos? If you've created a new argument, what have you brought into the world? It doesn't, it seems particular, but it's not a canonical sensible particular. How do we classify that? I don't have a good answer to that. I don't think Plato does, but I also don't think it worries him in this context. So, onwards.
Thanassis, anybody there?
Well, Alexander, please, it is your turn, and then we will proceed to the audience. Yeah.
Okay, well, all right, thank you. In that case, I guess I'm still in the same area as everyone else. It's the question of the two crafts of the philosopher. One of your answers to the possible objection was that Plato would just say that's how life is. That's not a good answer. It is so important, so crucial that one person does one thing, that to have the most important members of the city do two things is a problem for me. So I have a series of little comments to make regarding that. I think your astronomy and navigation parallel doesn't quite work out, because the navigator doesn't need to have the knowledge of astronomy that the astronomer has. Certainly not, he won't know anything about real astronomy. He has to learn some things about, the stars as we see them, so that he can use them in order to navigate. So I don't think that that's really, and I think that's why melete comes in there. Melete, I think, is something that you engage in a way without being quite systematic about it, as something that is a genuine techne. Furthermore, at the end, you characterize in your problems, you call dialectic the superordinate craft of guardianship. But just above that, you've written that, strictly speaking, in 6, the philosophers or the guardians possess 2 techni, hierarchically linked: philosophy construed as dialectic and ruling construed as philakike, which makes dialectic parallel to the astronomy that the navigator knows. And that is a problem to me, especially because it's not clear to me that the craftsworkers in general, have any knowledge. They need to know the forms in any strict sense, because they don't need to know whether it's a good thing, for example, to cure somebody or not. They just know how to cure them. So they don't deal with the good. They deal with what is good for my purpose in medicine, a purely instrumental sort of good, rather than whether it's a good thing to cure or not cure somebody, and so on. I think that's a major difference. And the philosopher is the only one who has that conspectus of a view of good things. So even the philosopher, in a way, I'm not even sure that, I won't say that. I was going to say that perhaps the philosopher is not really a mathematician, but the point is that philosopher learns mathematics. But in learning mathematics, a philosopher doesn't learn anything about whether mathematics does good things or not. They learn how to solve problems, how to prove theorems, and so on. They only learn about the good of mathematics once they get to the dialectic stage, it seems to me. So in general, I would very much like to see this dualism somehow, which still is there, in my opinion, disappear. But I don't know quite how to do it. Sophia might help, but Claudia has to tell us about that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Okay, so here's my best shot at resolving those worries. The principle of specialization, Plato's not fetishistic about this, right? The principle is, he says it doesn't matter if a carpenter and a shoemaker trade jobs. The principle is everyone should do the work that they're best suited to do as their contribution to the city. And it's significant, I think, that the guardians it's very explicit, they are paid a wage. That terminology is used repeatedly. They are paid a wage by the others for ruling, for being guardians. That's their actual job in the city. And so dialectic, that belongs to their training, and it's what they do for recreation when they're not working, because it's what they love to do. And somehow their nature has to be such that is an appropriate way of life for them. And the nature of the job of ruling has to be such that it does require that kind of dialectical education. And I don't see that as an impossibility for Plato. There were probably parallels that someone who knew more history of science could come up with, where to know one science you really do have to learn another in significant depth. And so it might be the case that all the opticians in the just city are going to have to be geometers. And that would just be the way the world is. And someone suited to be an optician would have to have a pretty mathematical nature, as well as being good at whatever specific things opticians have to know. And I don't really, Plato's account of human nature is not so fine-grained, and his theory about specialization is not so fine-grained, I think, as to rule this out. Just look at the way all the guardians have to be auxiliaries first. He's assuming that there's sufficient, that doesn't violate the principle of specialization. No, if at one time you become a soldier, then at another time you become a ruler. So I think there's some room for allowance for complexity built in. And the real question is, as I say, and as you were bringing up, what is it that they actually have to know? And how should we classify that knowledge? And I feel like you're being a bit stingy with episteme, and
yes.
The knowledge of the good that you'd want to say only the person with episteme has, I want to say that's actually noesis. That's what you get when you get to the unhypothetical first principle, is it all locks into place and you see what is good about health, what is good about X for any X that might be the end of a craft. And before that, everything is local and provisional, and yeah, the doctor takes health as a good, the apprentice politician takes the well-being of the city as a good and taking it as their end, so on and so on.
Well, not the good of the city. They take what matters in war and other things that are good for young people to do. They're still getting their advice from the 50-year-olds, I think. But in any case,
sure.
Thank you. May I make one more little point about the end of the ship, the captain? You translate. They don't understand that the true captain may pay attention to the year and all that if he's really to be the ruler of a ship so as to navigate, whether the others want him to or not, nor do they think it's possible to acquire any craft or pursuit, melete, and the craft of navigation together. That is only one possible way of reading the text. The text could also be that the important phrase being whether the others want him to do so or not, namely, okay, he has a ship now, but the others don't want him to do it anymore. Does he know how to maintain control of the sailors and all the people who don't like him there? So that way, it makes a different point from what you're saying here. It doesn't say that he needs two real crafts here. Anyway, sorry. Octavian needs to. Yeah.
That's that's Bloom's translation. Not sure how you feel about it.
No, Griffith, for example, gives both alternatives.
Yeah, no, that's why I give the Greek. Is I think that's a fascinating and puzzling and genuinely ambiguous sentence. Yeah. I'm not very attracted by the reading you suggest because the whole emphasis of the passage is on the fact that you can be an excellent navigator and not be able to keep control of a ship. Right. That's right. Not actually part of the craft. So I don't think that could be the point here. But yes, I think there are various other residual puzzles about how to take that sentence.
I'm withdrawing.
And other residual puzzles about the stargazer. I mean, I will admit that I was oversimplifying in my use of it because, as has already been pointed out, by Alexander, the navigator doesn't have to have the craft of astronomy in full, and he does have to know things about winds and other things. So there's a certain extra sort of distinctive content to this craft of navigation, and in general, the position just seems to be a bit more complicated than I was initially presenting it as.
Okay, I know that Octavian Purich has something.
Lucas would like to ask.
Okay, let's let Lucas speak and then we'll come back to you. We only have about 20 more minutes, so let's try to keep it short. Like me.
So I'll make that as short as possible. I'll try to bring some evidence by two different dialogues you hinted to. The statement and the sophist. The one I think is favor of your argument, the other perhaps against. Well, in the statement, surprisingly, as we all know, the strategic advantage of the wise ruler is not that he knows the general rules, the noi and the prescriptions, but the other way around, it's that he knows the specificities of it, every single case. So this perhaps might work in your way of reading the way, not the philosopher king, but this person must be knowledgeable in things. And from the sophist, I mean, in the sophist, the definition of the dialectician is propositionalist, the person who knows what participates in what. But does this mean that he necessarily has to have undergone some training which is more practical, and he might also be required by him to apply this in practical ways, but the definition is strictly propositional. So,
right.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful for me. As you point out, in the Statesman, we once again get ruling as a craft, and it's a very different craft, I think, from the Republic, and in some ways much more easily grasped as a craft, because we get this long analogy with weaving, and it's clear that it's a productive craft, and that the Statesman is able to sort of look at, as you say, different specific sort of bits of material among the citizens and weave them together into a unified city. So that's a much easier sort of case for my view, and Unitarians should be eager to wonder how much the Republic might be similar underneath. As for the sophist, if we're thinking of the same passage, it's another one in which he uses letter analogies, right? The dialectician is someone who knows what letters go together in forming syllables and words, and which ones don't. So, as you say, yes, which forms participate in each other and which don't. So I take it that cases like that still, for Plato, even though it's less obvious, can be seen as having a component that involves sort of general intelligible particulars, and then something at least analogous to sensible particulars, which is sort of recognitional capacity to do with particular cases. I didn't get into any of this, but in the original draft of the paper, I talk a lot about knowledge for Plato as involving recognitional capacity. So the whole point in the Euthyphro of learning what the form of piety is then you'll then be able to recognize all the instances of the pious. And it seems clear that you don't count as having general knowledge unless you also have this particular knowledge. If someone claims they know the form of piety, but they get the instances wrong, then that claim is null and void. They don't. So that's all sort of part of the background of why I want to see episteme in the default sense and techne as kind of a whole involving a full grasp of both these kinds of things, including if you like, the letters which are forms in both the images of those letters in particular cases as well. And I think that applies even when the things that we're looking at are forms and logoi, because you're encountering those logoi in a particular dialectical situation, and you have to be able to recognize them for what they are.
Okay, Octavian.
Okay, so thank you very much for your presentation. It challenged a lot of assumptions I had. My question, I will frame it with regards to your distinction between the two crafts of dialectic and statesmanship. And just to frame my question, I will use the difference that you made between contrast one of episteme, which seems to pick out, let's say, episteme as it refers to a special type of object, let's say the theoretical aspect of episteme, and contrast two, where it seems to qualify the provenience of an output. For example, if the output, I mean here, like producing the law or creating a treatment, comes from a medic, that piece of, let's say, bite-sized piece of is called episteme because it comes from a principle or from a holistic type of knowledge. So my question actually is, how would you describe the difference between dialectic and statesmanship? Because in a sense, right, statesmanship, if it doesn't have the contemplative element, right, in the first sense of dialectic, I'm not sure that Plato would still call it leadership, right? So usually Plato says that if something is not, right, the polis is not truly structured or leadership is not informed by the forms, you cannot really call it true leadership or a true city. So basically, since the contemplative object of statesmanship is identical with that of dialectic, but dialectic can take other forms, like other outputs than strictly statementship, basically. As you said, through dialectic, you can just create arguments, theoretical arguments, and so on and so forth, but you can also rule a city. What is the relation between the two crafts? Does one, dissolve in the other or not?
Right, thank you. There was a lot there, and I'm not sure I'll be able to address it all, but I'll try to say something kind of simple about what my basic view is. It's true that dialectic can have a lot of different outputs in a way, even though they're all going to be sort of manifest in intellectual activities, in presenting arguments and theories and teaching people and so on. And that's because, in a sense, I take it for Plato in the Republic, dialectic is completely universal. It's global. It can deal with any forms, in a certain way at least. And it also has this kind of center of gravity, this Schwerpunkt, this locus of specialization, which is the good itself, which somehow, irradiates, transforms everything else that it does. So that to me makes it very different from statesmanship, and I don't think there's any sense in which they have the same object, actually, because the object of the special object of dialectic is the good itself without qualification, and I take that to be different from the good for a human being or the good for a city. And I take it that what the rulers know is the good for a city. I strongly suspect that that involves knowing the good for a human being, and that it's derivative in some way of the good of a human being. But I think there's actually a bit of a philosophical mystery there about what the relationship is, and hard to address it without getting into some depth on questions about Plato's political philosophy and how far the city has a good of its own and how far it's reducible to the good of the citizens. Famous questions in another context. But that's my basic view on that.
Very good. Brennan.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for the awesome talk. I always love hearing about Techne. First, the principle of specialization is my hammer, and everything looks like a nail in light of it. I just don't like hearing that we shouldn't take it so seriously. But that's not really my point. I'm actually really interested in this one of the elements of your argument for why we should count this Techne. I think I agree with you. These people, I'm not going to call them kings, but they have a Techne. But one of the elements of the argument is that because they receive the misthos, the wage, we can see them as having the specialization. And I don't really see how that argument is supposed to work. It doesn't seem to me that that passage that mentioned, there are actually a few passages that mention their misthos, but that passage that you're referring to makes the case that they have a techne. It seems like what that passage shows is that they are integrated into a division of labor, right? But it doesn't make the case that they have a specialization. Even if they weren't integrated into the division of labor, that is, there's no demand for the good that they're producing, they could still count as having a specialization and having a techne, right? Even if they're completely left out of the division of labor. And indeed, we could criticize that division of labor for being faulty because it hasn't generated demand for this specialization. So it doesn't seem to me that that generates a reason to think that it is a techne or that it's a specialization. But also, I just want to, you're probably already familiar with Melissa Lane's recent book of Rule in Office, but she talks about this misthos. And she makes the case that we should not understand the guardians, so both of the upper classes, as receiving money as their misthos, but we should understand them as receiving provisions in kind for the production of their good for the city, right? The thing that they are offering in the division of labor, so that we don't understand them as receiving money or really like taxes that they then go and spend, because that would violate the idea that they're never supposed to handle gold and silver. But we understand them as receiving provisions. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about the Mista, so I just wanted to recommend looking at it. But my larger point was that I don't think it makes the case that you're suggesting about showing that they have the Techne.
Right.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Yeah, so several points there. I should look at Lane again, but I think that's almost explicit in the Republic, actually, in one of these passages, that, what they're getting is like lentils or grain or something. They're getting provisions, which they need to share and make last, not money. That's right, because it's explicit, actually, in the Noble Lie. They're not allowed to have gold and silver. Absolutely prohibited. So it has to be in the form of provisions. I don't think it's any less a wage for that, though, so I'm not sure where you were headed with that. They are paid workers. It is true that that does not show they have a craft, because even in the first city, there are going to be paid laborers who don't sort of rise to the level of practicing any craft and just do sort of random manual labor as required by the craftspeople. And I guess the guardians could be like that, right? So it doesn't, strictly speaking, speak to the point about Techne. I find it fascinating on sort of broader grounds, because I think Plato's doing something very innovative and important for political philosophy, kind of normalizing the work of ruling and presenting it not as a kind of top-down power relation, but as a job that people could be hired to do, and making this actually kind of constitutive of a just society. I think that's a thought that we should continue to work with. So I'm sort of possibly led astray by my independent fascination at this point. But it certainly sets up the idea that they've got an ergon, that they are, as you say, integrated with the work of the just city. And so it's kind of indirect supporting evidence for seeing them as craftspeople like any others, since I don't, in fact, think that they fall below the level and are mere manual laborers. As to the principle of specialization, I think, those of you who are mad at me for saying c'est la vie, I think your argument is with Plato here, and you should figure out what you think, because he's the one who's got these people being soldiers, being philosophers, being rulers, and there's got to be some way, something's got to give, there's got to be some way that doesn't violate whatever principle of specialization he holds dear.
Fair enough.
Well, if I may, no, I may not, because Socrates wants to say something.
Hello, Rachel. Thanks a lot for this talk. I hope you can hear me. I had a small question about the interplay, let's say, between the theoretical and the practical element, because you also mentioned the Aristotelian aspect, and also the question of principles, general principles. And what came to my mind is a passage from Book 4 in the Republic, where we have the parts of the soul distinguished shortly before the declaration that the typos of justice has been found. And these parts of the soul, in a way, are distinguished precisely to preserve and respect the principle of non-contradiction, or a version of it. So I was wondering if this picture, which is the big scale, let's say, and the notion of typos has normatively a very important role in the Republic as a whole. I was wondering if this distinction between the principle of non-contradiction, a version of it, and the parts of the soul at this relatively early stage can have an influence, or how it fits with the narrative of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you. That, to me, represents a huge puzzle, actually, which is, how does the epistemology of books 5 to 7 relate to the tripartite soul at all? And I've always been puzzled, baffled even by that question. Why is it that we get this introduction of the parts of soul in Book 4, and then they as far as one can tell from the explicit argument, they seem to be completely forgotten in the detailed epistemology of V-VII. And I don't have a good answer to that. I struggle with it in another paper on the parts of soul. I'll send you a copy of that one. You can tell me what you think, but I don't think I have a satisfactory answer.
Anyone else has any question? Leslie?
Xanthippe would like.
By all means, anybody. I can't see people there, so, but Leslie Brown also.
Yes.
You need to unmute yourself.
Leslie Brown first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Yes.
I've got a rather pedantic question, or rather remark, on your second passage, the famous passage. You said that there's an implication that dialectic is a craft because he speaks about the other crafts, hi ally techni. But my pedantic point is that I believe Greek can say that without thereby implying that the other thing is itself a craft. And I seem to remember there's a passage in Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, book 2:4, where being asked about virtue being teachable, he draws a comparison with what he calls the ally techni. But of course, he doesn't think virtue is a techne, so he can speak about the other crafts without meaning the crafts other than virtue. He can mean the crafts which are other things than virtue. So that's Niketh 2:4, which I'm quoting from the top of my head. But as I say, it's a very pedantic point, but I don't think you can rely on that to say that in that passage dialectic is characterized as a craft. It was a great paper, Rachel. Thank you very much.
Leslie, I have a chat to you. You should look at the chat.
Anyway, I don't know what's going on in the chat, but Leslie, thank you so much for that, and thank you for being here. Yes, I had a nasty feeling when I said that about the other crafts, because I dimly sensed there was some famous passage where it can't actually mean other, and of course you've remembered what it was, which I couldn't. So yes, I will have to rethink that and find further evidence. Thank you.
Any other questions from anyone? If not, I think, let me, before thanking Rachel, let me say that this, as Thanassis pointed out, is the end of this academic year part of the program. We still have terrific stuff coming in the fall. We have Christopher Moore in September. We have M.M. McCabe in October. We have Thanassis Gkatzaras in November. And to top it all off, we have Whitney Schwab in December. So I hope that you have a very good summer. You learn more about the Republic, and we continue trying to understand this incredible, incredible text with this, well, not equally incredible, but very, very fine audience. Thank you very much. Rachel, you closed this in a perfect way. As always, you made us think, and you made us think without getting us to be angry, and that's really terrific. Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. We'll see you in the fall.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander, and thank you, everyone.
Very much.
Goodbye, everyone.
A small ad I would like to make that it is also Vasilis Karasmanis on October 1st.
Oh, we forgot. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And okay, thank you very much for being here. Enjoy the summer, and looking forward to see you in September. Thank you.
Very good. Bye-bye.